12:01 and I'm a bit mindful of time. So welcome to this very first webinar of Team Society. It's the first of a series that we're putting together this fall. Just to introduce myself, I'm Thomas Moe-Skjoldsvold. I'm at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture, and I'm coordinating Team Society. And also, just before we start, I want to say big thanks to Sarah Heidenreich. She was also helping up a lot with putting all of this together. So, there we are. The plan for this brief webinar that we're doing today is, first of all, to introduce Team Society. Team Society is a new effort. It's organized as part of NTNU Energy. And it also has strong links to NTNU Sustainability, where we have a sister project on sustainable mobility, which also focuses a lot on sort of the social, scientific, and humanities-oriented aspects of transitions. And what I'll try to do is sort of through this brief introduction, I'll introduce the program, what we want to do, but also try to sketch a little bit broad a discussion about the role of social science and humanities in the energy and sustainability transition. And to help us out with that, we also have a special guest with us, Benjamin Sovacool, who will be given a little presentation on this from his perspective, and then discuss all of this a little bit with us. Great. So first of all, just to remind you all about why we're here to a certain extent. I guess you know this, but it's good to take a little bit of a step back and go to the natural and biological sciences, because we are in trouble in terms of the climate and in terms of other environmental indicators. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with the way we use, consume, produce energy. And I think then fundamentally we can begin to ask sort of this challenge that we're up against. What type of challenge is it? Let's see if I can make the PowerPoint react here. I mean, it can be conceptualized in a lot of different ways. You can say it's a policy challenge, a technology challenge, an innovation challenge, lifestyle challenge, maybe economic challenge, perhaps, communication challenge, a behavior change challenge. And I think probably all of these are to a certain extent quite true. One way to really sort of dig into the societal aspects of this is to go to the discipline of history and history of science, technology, and innovation. This is from some former colleagues of Benjamin Sovacool, actually, who've been sort of taking a broad historical sweep, zooming out and claiming that the past sort of 250 years that we've been through has been characterized by a set of sort of overarching rules, a kind of directionality, some common goals that even though there is a lot of difference between countries and regions and so on and so forth, there has been a push towards new forms of production, urbanization, state making, internationalization, the emergence of markets, welfare states, these kinds of things, and new modes of domestication of nature. And what these scholars are claiming is that, just to give a quote, that this is a constant move towards increased labor productivity, mechanization, reliance on fossil fuels, resource intensity, and global value chains. So another image that sort of shows some of the same is this one, which indicates that we've never really done anything of the magnitude that we need to in the near future. So this is, again, very broad, sweeping image at a global scale, illustrating that while we've done a lot of innovation, added a lot of new technologies over these years, we've never really transitioned on a global scale away from any of the old ones. So we've added to our biofuels, we've added to our coal, we've added to our oil, gas, hydro, and nuclear. And now, of course, we need something else. We need also not only to add, but to take away. And as universities, we respond, and as research communities, I would say primarily through technological innovation. We do that at NTNU, which makes sense. We're a technical university, but this is also strongly echoed then in sort of European and national policy, which really focus on technological solutions. This is good. We need the technological solutions. But this Team Society initiative that we're launching is also launched because this sort of unilateral focus on technology produces some paradoxes, some challenges, and some blind spots that I think are important to address. So real quickly, yeah, it's not quite responding the way I wanted to, but yeah, a paradox that we want to address is that this strong focus on technology, it can promote a static understanding inadvertently of society. So you have the idea that technologies can change, whereas sort of societies are more or less stable. And this is echoed, I think, in a lot of important scenario and modeling exercises that really focus on large-scale technology solutions. It feeds into policymaking, really sort of limiting the imagination that we have and limiting the political toolbox. And it continues to emphasize this sort of technological add-on when we also need to phase out. But just to not scare you too much, we don't want Team Society to be anti-technology. That's not the point. We also want to address sort of challenges of technology implementation. So we need new technologies, but we need them to work in society. That has to do with consumers, with technology users, citizens, but also with a lot of other things, regulations, value change, choices, lifestyles, and culture. I've flagged that as red there because we'll have a webinar on that in a couple of weeks. Infrastructure, organization systems, political feasibility. All of these things sort of feed into our ambition, I think, of both understanding and promoting societal conditions that enable successful applications of these new technologies. And finally, I think we want to address some sort of blind spots that I think are out there. Energy infrastructures and transport infrastructures are more important, I guess, than you might think. They are the backbones of our societies, and changing them is not only sort of discrete technology changes. It actually entails then changing the very foundations for how we live, how we relate to each other, how we relate to place, how we produce cultures, how we relate to the natural ecology, these types of things. And since they mean so much when we change them, it also has implications for society. So for things like justice and equity and broader ideas about how to organize future society. So we want to address that as we talk now more and more about how to accelerate technological change. How do we avoid sort of this focus on speed taking precedence, for instance, over other societal goals? So I think this amounts to also an interest in understanding and minimizing unintended consequences of technologies. And in some, I mean, from a social scientific perspective, this is good news for the engineers because it signals that engineering is a lot more important than you might think. It is actually shaping the very foundations of our future society. And in Team Society, we are addressing these paradoxes, challenges, and blind spots through the mobilization of multiple disciplines, multiple methods, multiple modes of working. So far, we have anthropology involved, geography, political science, psychology, science and technology studies, and sociology. And that is just in alphabetical order there, so no priorities given to anyone. But this webinar and this webinar series, I think it should also be considered sort of open invitation to the rest of the SSH communities at NTNU, and definitely also to the technology-oriented communities that we are keen to both engage and work with. Just to give you a teaser of what we're planning to do in terms of research, we have some projects lined up that are just starting. Anthropologists and geographers will be exploring the potential of things like visualization, visual methods, story maps, particularly related to things like renewable energy siting processes. We have an exciting project on political communication and psychology, which deals with how old new media sort of feeds into the development of resistance towards wind farms. And we have an STS project on innovation and societal aspects around floating offshore wind. Beyond the actual research, we want this to be a platform that strengthens a lot of the already good research that we have going on. There's a lot of good, actually, energy, social science, and humanities going on at NTNU. There is a lot of individual researchers, a lot of social science projects, research council projects, European projects, as well as a number of research centers that SSH scholars are involved in. And I think quite uniquely in the Norwegian context, at least, a lot of the research is spanning across technical and social science disciplines. And that has its advantages, but also its challenges. So this platform, I think, will sort of showcase and try to emphasize SSH on the terms of SSH, in a sense. And we have some things we want to achieve. So we want to push towards NTNU, towards the technology-oriented communities to strengthen the role of social science and humanities in research and education on energy and sustainability. And we want to also sort of work strategically then towards funding bodies, the other policy communities, these types of things, and towards broader publics. And this, I guess, concludes my introduction to this. Just make sure that you zoom in next time. That's on the 13th of October. It will be a super interesting webinar. I'm not sure who will present it. It's a lot of authors involved, but they will at least talk about how cultural eyeglasses affect political opinions about energy. From the Department of Sociology and Political Science here at NTNU. But now I want to just give the word to Benjamin Sovacool, who is here to help us think further on the role of energy and social science and humanities. Just to tell you who he is, he's a professor of energy policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, sorry about that. He works, according to his website, on a lot of different things: renewable energy, energy efficiency, the politics of large-scale energy infrastructure, deciding public policy, and he is also the editor of Energy Research and Social Science, a large journal. He has edited or written no less than 18 books, according to Wikipedia, and more than 300 peer-reviewed papers. So this should provide an interesting perspective for us at NTNU. So I'll just give you the floor, Benjamin, and mute myself.
Great. Let me make sure. There we go. Sorry, I was making sure I could unmute myself. Zoom, we'll do this one more time. So thank you, Tomas. So today's presentation is going to be really, really brief, and it really fits into one of the core areas that Tomas had mentioned. I served as an advisor for 5 years to the European Commission on one of their general advisory boards on energy. And I was surrounded by engineers and physical scientists. And the question was always asked, what value does social science have? What value do the humanities have, other than just making life more difficult? Because it seems to them that all we do is critique things and deconstruct things. And the engineers come up with solutions, and all that we do is stand in their way. So it's even this kind of anti-progressive intellectual effort, which meant a lot of them didn't want social scientists on their research teams. So I slowly developed a kind of piece of arguments that I think are really strong, I hope they're strong, in favor of social science, kind of justifying beyond tokenism, beyond just adding work package 6, which is the social science, why social science and the humanities are essential, not peripheral, are essential when we think about energy transitions or just energy studies more broadly. And I've only come up with 5 reasons. So that's all I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes. But I think there are 5 really good reasons. And I think the first one actually starts with something negative. It starts with a critique. It even starts with a critique of my own research and a lot of the research that we do. So here you can see a very high level take that offers a typology of the research we do in the academy. And basically there are 4 quadrants. And the quadrants we've named them after a famous innovator, just to help kind of ground the quadrant. I think a lot of us do, especially those of us in business schools where I'm at, fit into the Niels Bohr quadrant in the bottom right, which is very conceptual work, right? Very theoretical work, maybe on history or business model theory or value creation or Schumpeter creative destruction. Or maybe some of us are in the upper left, the Thomas Edison quadrant, which is very applied, very commercially oriented, very empirical, but they don't really advance concepts very much. They could care less about theory, especially work from practitioners, those working at government ministries, those working in living labs, those working for companies. And then, of course, we have this bottom left, which is the worst quadrant, which we've just called the rubbish bin. We didn't name anybody there. We thought about naming some people there, but we didn't name anybody there. And this is really research that's either so bad, so poorly designed, it makes no contribution, or it's biased by design. It is sponsored by ExxonMobil to cast doubt on climate change, or the tobacco industry, right, to say that smoking is good for your health. So I think most of our research probably fits into the Edison and the Bohr quadrants, and we try to avoid the rubbish bin quadrant, but very little research is in the upper right of the quadrant, which is the Louis Pasteur quadrant, of research that simultaneously advances both science and solves social problems. So it's socially relevant and theoretically relevant. And this is called the Pasteur quadrant because Pasteur developed pasteurization, which both enhanced our understanding of the science of microbes and bacteria, but also had very practical applications in terms of refrigeration and the extended life of food, which had very good impacts on food security. My rough take as an editor, and even as a prolific author, as Tomas was saying, is that maybe 5% of our research falls into this Louis Pasteur quadrant. So I think one of the key things that social science can do is push the research community to not just be applied, to not just be theoretical, and of course to avoid the rubbish bin, and end up in this really unique space of making dual contributions to concepts as well as solving social problems. So it basically makes our research more relevant, more translatable for policy. And this is something that the physical scientists are often really, really bad at. And this would be really well suited to people in the domains of marketing, communication studies, science studies, public policy, and political science, and even behavioral science, because it's all about how we translate findings into social impact. So that's the first reason. The second reason comes from this diagram. It's not one of my own. It's from some colleagues at Carnegie Mellon. And I like that this is the, quote, simplified diagram of energy behavior. But as you can note into this simplified diagram, when people make household decisions about how they use energy, the technologies and the fuels and the energy devices are just a small part of the triangle. They are mediated and affected by a whole number of personal and contextual things, things like behaviors and dispositions and personalities, things like practices and habits, things like prices and policy frameworks, and even things like demographics, gender, household size, income, education. So if we're going to ever understand why people put energy to use, to do useful things, well, all of those domains are clearly where social scientists play a dominant role. From behavioral science to sociology to anthropology and ethnography to energy studies and economics and even demography. The third reason I think is a bit trickier, and it has to do with risk. So what we've done here in this piece that was the header for a special section in Nature Climate Change and Nature Energy. It's the only ever cross special issue they've ever done. So it was all about the kind of social science insights for energy and climate. And what we did in this introductory piece is we took all of the main energy sources, oil, gas, and coal, and we showed on different dimensions of sustainability or energy security or affordability or availability, how all of them have different risks. Oil is plentifully available and kind of energy intensive, but of course risks oil spills and climate change. Gas actually is very cheap and is maybe a moderately clean energy fuel, but it lists pipeline accidents. And of course, methane is a potent contributor to greenhouse gas. Coal also provides nice baseload power and is ubiquitous in more than 150 countries, but you have black lung disease and coal mine collapses. And unfortunately, this tension between pros and cons isn't only with fossil fuels. You can see here, it also spans hydroelectric dams, reservoir construction, flooding, emissions from decomposition of vegetation, dam failures and breaches, cost overruns, interruption of fisheries, solar and wind, avian mortality, bat mortality, toxic materials in the life cycles, manufacturing externalities, nuclear power, spent nuclear fuel, nuclear accidents, nuclear proliferation and weapons, and even, unfortunately for us, things like energy efficiency and biofuel, the food versus fuel debate for biofuels, as well as fertilizers and pesticides, and energy efficiency, disruption of business models, as well as toxic materials and things like energy efficient lamps and light bulbs. So unfortunately, there is no such thing as a risk-free source of energy, or even a risk-free source of saving energy. Instead, they're all about very complex intersections of risk and how those risks are constructed, how they're deconstructed, and how they're deemed acceptable or not is clearly the domain of many disciplines. And this is where I also want to go in to where the arts and humanities have a very strong role to play, because they can get into some of the aesthetic and symbolic aspects and visual aspects of these technologies. And just to give you two contrasting views, this was a really neat poster that I saw in South Korea about the benevolence of a nuclear future. Doesn't it look lovely? Look at the happy atoms, right? And look at how they're helping promote sustainability and medical healthcare and energy security in the home, right? So it's a really nice graphical way, colorful way of persuading someone that the risks of nuclear energy are acceptable. Or conversely, this is in the United Nations headquarters in New York. It's actually a tapestry, and this is by the Ukraine. And it was actually crafted after the Chernobyl accident to talk about the danger of technology. And again, look at the visual symbolism of the snakes and the phoenixes and the dragons and the eagles, and the way that technology has a dual edge where it can cause a lot of misery and suffering. It's Icarus flying too close to the sun. And so I think that the humanities and the social sciences can really help really affect how we have knowledge of risk, how we define risk, how it's communicated, even visually and aesthetically. The engineering sciences and life sciences can talk about health effects and vulnerability and pollution flows. The natural sciences can talk about modeling and distribution, and the social sciences can talk about kind of risk interpretation, risk planning, regulatory capture, and the socialization of risk. So there can be an entire social science agenda that is centered on risk, that doesn't take it for granted, and that views it as a socially constructed phenomenon. The fourth area is one even closer to my heart, and again, it crosses this whole social science and arts and humanities divide because it deals with the ethics of energy. So here we're getting into philosophy, moral studies, ethics, and legal studies. And when many of us see graphs like this, right, is the global energy system fair? When we see that the 20 million people in New York consume the same equivalent amount of electricity as the 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, is this a fair system? Is this an equitable system? Is it a just system that gives everyone their fair share, that enables them to achieve their capabilities? Probably not. And you can also see that this intersects quite plainly with issues of gender and health. So this is one of the most depressing things you may ever see. Sorry, Tomas. This is the basic study called the Global Burden of Disease. and essentially maps how humanity dies. So this is how we all die. Basically, it's morbidity and mortality converted to what's called disability-adjusted life years. And what you see on the left are the causes, things like smoking, right, or having high cholesterol. And what you see in the upper right are the diseases, things like pulmonary disease or neonatal disorders. And what is very striking, if you have good eyes, the fourth item on the list is an energy issue. It is household air pollution from cook stoves. So it connects intimately with notions of energy access. There are 4 million people who die every year prematurely because of how they cook, because they have to use solid fuel, biomass, or wood. And I like this campaign that was run by the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, which said, what's the most dangerous things a woman can do? It's not go on a bad date. It's not walk through the streets at night. It's actually just cook in the home. And 80% of these deaths are not people who are 80 years old or 90 years old. 80% of these deaths are young children under the age of 5 or mothers under the age of 40. So it is a monumental health epidemic. More people die from how they cook than malaria and tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS. And by 2050, more people may die from those than the 3 diseases combined, right? So this issue of fairness is literally a matter of life and death. 11 million people actually died, or 11 people rather, during the minute it took me to explain this slide. And solving that issue requires interdisciplinary solutions that involve social science. It is not just changing the stoves and sources of pollution in the left kind of column of the table. It's also the middle one, which is about changing the living environment. So this is building design, architecture, planning studies, and then also the right one, which is changing user practices and behavior, which would be the domain of, again, sociology, anthropology, behavioral science, and a lot of the other applied social sciences. And finally, I think a fifth reason, maybe more prosaic, is that the social sciences and humanities can humanize what are normally very kind of cold, utilitarian, dispassionate discussions of technology. We can take you to China and have you meet the farmers who are struggling to survive in the cope of air pollution from climate change, as well as from fossil fuel-fired power plants. Something like 7% of Chinese GDP is lost to pollution each year. It leads the world in the amount of disrupted economic activities, and those aren't experienced fairly. They're often experienced by small and medium enterprise farmers. Or here, where you can talk about the life of a 9-year-old coal miner in India who is paid less than $1 a day to provide coal that helps lift other children and women out of energy poverty. Or here, these are the thyroid cancer survivors of Chernobyl in Belarus. And this photograph was taken in the year 2014, and the boy on the right is only 11 years old, which means this did not happen in 1986 after the disaster. All of Belarus and the Ukraine are still suffering the health impacts from the massive radiation contamination following the Chernobyl disaster. And humanizing this plight is a very important antidote to these triumphant visions of a clean, secure nuclear future. It counteracts the very nice glossy atoms diagram I showed you earlier from South Korea. Or here, this is an actual young cobalt miner in the Congo who is literally mining copper and cobalt that end up in many of the electric vehicle batteries that are roaming around the streets of Oslo and the rest of Norway. And it's the job of social science can document these lived experiences, can document the narratives and the stories and the struggles and the political economy and the political ecology of these types of winners and losers in our overall energy transitions in ways that cost-benefit analysis or other non-social science approaches just miss. So, to me, my last slide, I think that what you're doing in team society, trying to make a more central role for the social sciences is incredibly important, because to me, the social sciences and the arts and humanities are essential at making our research more practical and problem-driven and relevant, especially if we hit Pasteur's quadrant. They are also elemental in helping us understand all of the non-technical things about behavior and use and consumption and demand. They are key to helping us actually better understand risks and all aspects of those risks, how they're constructed, deconstructed, framed, communicated, visualized. They're needed to help us get into these really dangerous issues, these troubling issues of vulnerability, poverty, justice, and dispossession that literally affect the life and death of millions of people every year. And they are one of the few tools we have that can humanize what are otherwise very technical and cold discussions that affect everyday lives. And Tomas, with that, I'm very happy to turn it back over to you and for discussion.
Yeah, great. That's really sort of a broad, very nice overview of a lot of interesting points. And you're free to do as Marius is doing, use a clap symbol to to highlight enthusiasm for this, or in any other way do so. So what we want to do now, I guess, is open this for discussion. I mean, I've a couple of things I would want to ask you, and then sort of open it to the audience. We're not a super huge audience, but I think we're a large enough audience to have to sort of mobilize the chat here in some way. So if people can either use the raise arm function or the chat to signal an interest in asking Benjamin anything, then we'll pick it up in that way.
Or Tomas, can't they also ask you questions? And
sure.
They save the most difficult questions for you and not for me?
That's a fair comment. That's a fair comment. So let's see what people end up doing. I wanted to ask you a sort of a hypothetical here, because what we're doing, of course, is in a sense institutionally internal. You're coming from the outside here, but let's say you were the advisor. I know you've been advising a lot of different actors over the years. Let's say you've been the advisor of the principal of NTNU as a large technical university with ambitions of developing knowledge for a better world. How would you, that is the slogan nonetheless. So what would your key advice be to someone like our principal in thinking about energy transitions and the relationship between social, technical sciences, humanities?
So I think,
practical terms, sorry.
I mean, I'll give you a very, maybe indirect answer, but I think if I was an actual advisor, I'd make 3 recommendations. And the first one would be that when you think through interdisciplinarity, make it a challenge-based program rather than a discipline-based program. And you kind of have done this already, but basically what we've suggested earlier is don't organize things around colleges or disciplines, which is how 90% of things are still organized. And it's also still how we organize research, like in the UK. You submit to the ESRC or the EPSRC or the NERC. You don't submit to all of them. So I think kind of problem-driven, challenge-driven, mission-driven research platforms can inspire communities to come together and coalesce around a problem in ways that aren't necessarily predetermined. It's not like you say they have to have a sociologist and an anthropologist and a historian. So I think working out the key 2 or 3 challenges that you want to accomplish and make them specific, make the Norwegian energy transition more just, right? Or whatever it could be. That's the first one. I think the second one is make sure that you fund it really, really well. Obviously, I think we don't do this quite as well as we had hoped at the Sussex Energy Group because we actually have no core funding. All of our funding is projects. So the ability to do synthetic work that's across projects is very difficult. And there's a really good example of how to do this. In Nottingham, it's not even a Sussex example. In Nottingham, they had an exercise about 10 years ago where they tried to create centers of excellence. And of course, they created like 5 engineering ones. But they did choose 1 social science one. And the social science one, I think, is an incredible model. It's called the Human Rights Lab. It had about £6 million of base funding. So Nottingham put a lot of money into this. And their goal was to end modern slavery. So also a very practical modern goal, which is really important. Who's against ending modern slavery? And they've had like 200 people come through that center in 5 years. And they've made incredible progress, both understanding modern slavery and trying to end it. But I get the sense that that is the level of investment, this kind of small little groups without any funding or £50,000 or a few $100,000 a year isn't enough. If you really want transformative research, it is expensive. And it will rival investments in many of the big engineering labs. And the final thing, and this is connected to that, one of the reasons the Rights Lab is so important is because out of their core staff, they have about a dozen people who don't do academic work. Their job is impact. Their job is translating the findings from research into policy briefs, press releases, blogs. They have someone who only does social media. And this is all so effective that the head of the Rights Lab had dinner with Theresa May last year and had a bill introduced to the UK about modern slavery. So that's the level of impact they're having. They even had a campaign on Twitter where you could donate and had alliances with things like Save the Children, right, to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. They also had another campaign where they got modern slaves to use their phones to document where they were to help international police and Interpol track down human traffickers. So it's like, that's awesome. I don't know if I want to have dinner with Boris Johnson, but to be able to have that level of impact is something we often forget about. So I guess it's also, the third thing is, don't just make it academic work. Have dedicated people who will focus on policy and impact, whether it's changing policies at local levels, national levels, or changing business practices, or changing the national debate, or crowdsourcing, or whatever it is. So I think all three of those things, make it challenges-based, fund it at a very high level, and focus on impact, are three recommendations that hold true for you.
Thanks. These are some really important comments. And now we have a raised hand from Hovert Falkenberg.
Yes. Yes, do you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin and Thomas, for your contributions so far. During Benjamin's talk, I strongly recognized the history that we come from, namely the pillars in which academia is organized. We have these disciplines, and connections between them are very difficult. When I saw you talking about your slides, there was this voice to the back of my mind that kept saying, well, all is fine and well, but this is still compatible with the engineers doing the engineering stuff and the social scientists doing the social stuff, and maybe also humanities people doing the meaning and the interpretation stuff. And in the short discussion after your presentation, you already mentioned this lesson of making things problem-driven as a kind of solution towards that problem. But still, I think the pitfall is there. How would you advise us to prevent that we come up with a beautiful problem-driven project, but after the startup meeting, we go to our own laboratories and faculties, do our own stuff, and 3 years at the end into the project, we come together again and look for integration. That's obviously not how we mean to do this transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, but how would you prevent stepping in that pitfall?
Yeah, let me have a comment and then an answer. And Tomas, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. But my comment is, I have been tempted before to privilege the social sciences, especially when I'm in hostile communities or groups that are like not anti-social science, but they don't understand it, right? We don't need any more projects where it's $9 spent on the natural sciences and $1 spent on social science. That said, I do think there's a very strong role that the natural sciences can play, and I don't think the solution is to train the natural scientists to be social scientists or to train the social scientists to be natural scientists. And there was a really neat article, Tomas mentioned energy research and social science. There was a really neat article by Mark Cooper about 3 years ago called Building the Physics into the Social. And the critique there was that lots of social scientists like us are really bad at the natural science. We get it wrong. We don't understand units. We confuse kilowatts with kilowatt hours, right? We don't understand thermodynamics, right? So our technical understanding is flat out poor. So I think that the solution there is to not necessarily always privilege social science. It's more see us as equal partners, and we all stay within our comfort zones, but we don't necessarily have to become trained to do everything, which may not even be possible. As to your more pragmatic question about how do you make sure that synthesis is not a token, that's very hard. And one of the biggest interdisciplinary centers that I directed, which ended last year, was called CIED, the Center on Innovation and Energy Demand. It ran for 5 years, was 5 years and about £3 million, only social science, which is a lot. We had like 30 people in the project, and we struggled with this. And what ended up happening, what I think is what you said, it's like we all went off and did our projects for the first 4 years, and in the 5th year we came back and tried to synthesize, but then it was a whole mismatch of methods, people, concepts, technologies. We did synthesize them, but we got lucky. And the papers methodologically were completely incongruent with their cases and their kind of research designs and their timing and all that, like the times they chose to study in the technologies. I think a far better way to do it is to make synthesis perpetual in the project. You're doing it in year 1, you're doing it in year 2, you're doing it in year 3. If you were to have these kind of Gantt diagrams or these diagrams in your project, it's a transversal work package. So the synthesis part isn't all the way at the end, it's at the bottom that cuts across everything. Same with knowledge exchange, right? Now that said, it looks really nice on the diagram and you can make them really colorful so they stand out. But then the question is, well, how do you do that pragmatically? And I think it just means you have to make sure that everyone is talking 3 or 4 times a year, updating each other, and you never lose sight of the synthesis and you have it built into the proposal from the start. So it's not ad hoc synthesis at the end, it's proactive synthesis that's planned. That's the only answer I've got though, because it's really hard. And even we only did this year. So we're also just learning how to even grapple with this issue. Tomas, do you have anything to add? Because it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question and a difficult one, and I guess one that we're all sort of struggling with. But I would actually flip your comment, Benjamin, because I would agree, of course, that we social humanities oriented scholars often get basic facts, call it that, about the technological aspects wrong. Though on the other hand, I would say that a lot of technical projects, most technologically oriented projects, they also have a kind of implicit social theory that they build on. So, and that can be an implicit social theory which concerns how people use technologies. It can be an implicit social theory about how people will respond to technology projects by protesting or applauding them, or these kinds of things. It can be an implicit social theory about how societies will develop together with new infrastructures, for instance, carbon capture and storage. What would that do to a society compared to a society built around, say, smaller, more flexible technology-oriented things? So there's, and I would argue that not that sort of makes our wrongs right, but these implicit social theories are quite often also flat out wrong. And rather than sort of playing then this research-oriented blame game, you engineers are doing it wrong, we social scientists are doing it wrong, I think it's also an institutional funding-oriented and policy-oriented challenge, very much in line with the sort of 3 things that you pointed out, that we should have a sort of policy that pushes projects that in new ways integrates. So as you say, not about work package 6 doing acceptance, but rather thinking more fundamentally then. So how can social science inform also the other work in these projects, and how sort of to flip that, can the engineering oriented work affect that would be a long-term and slow, gradual thing that would have to be done in parallel with this more pragmatic project-to-project approach. But I think sort of pushing for more fundamental changes in that way is at least warranted.
Yeah, thank you both for your answers.
I'll go over it. I just shared with you an example of when you do synthesis. You can read this article. It was what I said. It's like 4 work packages, but this was a neat way, because what we did, even though it was ad hoc, so it was still like everyone came back at the end, all that we asked people who led each work package to do, tell us your single most important finding. And then we wrote an article around the 4 most important findings. And it works well. We got lucky, I guess, because you could synthesize it. Yeah. But that gives you at least an example. And there we kind of, what was a weakness for very different work packages with different methods became a mixed method study, right? Where it looks like reverse engineered, it was there. So that could just be an example of one way to do it. But this was, this was hard. And I could have shared with you 10 failed papers that were never published because we couldn't get the synthesis right.
Okay, thanks.
So I see Marius Korsnes has raised his hand.
And what a fan Marius has, right? That's lovely, Marius. You're my biggest fan.
Yeah, I'll change to the real picture now. Oh yeah. So thanks for the very interesting discussion. I am a big fan. I'm a big fan, Benjamin. Thank you. It was very interesting. And I was wondering, I just had like this, riff off of what you just talked about, and it kind of struck me that one of the things that I can tell you an example. So we just got a research project which is using the arts and humanities to address meat consumption in Norway, trying to basically explore how meat is embedded in Norwegian culture and practices, and using arts to try to challenge some of that. And of course, it's connected to climate, to emissions, CO2 emissions, because meat causes a lot of emissions. But what happened was that was also spread on a lot of different social media and web pages in Norway, specifically right-wing web pages. But and there was a lot of comments about the project itself, where people saying like, why on earth have we provided funding for this type of project? This is a waste of public money, and this is just a lot of people who are basically just having fun and doing nothing useful. And I was thinking maybe one of the problems is also that the narratives that we tell about what's useful are very much connected to big technological and innovation projects that bring something very, very useful and directly to society. And that could be also one thing that we could challenge by challenging those narratives of what is actually useful research. So I was wondering, what do you think about that?
No, I think it demonstrates the importance of independent research, and I think it also demonstrates that whenever you're attacking hegemonic discourses or cultural things that are so taken either for granted or as a core part of identity, like eating meat. The JPI Hope project that I mentioned, we still have a paper under review. It's been under review for a long time at Climatic Change, that also has a section on meat, and these quotes from people who are just like, I don't get full on vegetables, I need meat. Or I was raised on meat. So it is, and this, I'm an American, I have dreams about hamburgers. So I also appreciate the kind of role of diet in personal identity, and how people are far less likely to change dietary preferences or travel preferences than they are maybe energy preferences. So there's a bit more stickiness with those practices. But I think it's a shame that you have this right-wing, divide. And it's also, I was just talking to a colleague yesterday in the United States where she had a study about climate change communication, and it was also picked up by Fox News, and they attacked her personally and called her a fat bedwetter. It's like, what? Like, when did we get into these types of name calling on like national debate and dialogue? So it's not just you, Marius. I think it just demonstrates, oddly, view it as a sign of success. View it that the more people that complain about the research actually take you seriously enough to engage. So oddly, keep pissing them off. And as long as the Research Council knows this was good work to be funded, and it is, right? Because diet is one of the huge levers we have to change climate change mitigation. And there's not much you can do in Norway, let's be honest, right? Other than divest from Statoil and divest from your oil and gas assets. It's aviation and meat are probably the two, and shipping are probably the three big areas. So it's like, this is the big area. So I think try to just get a thicker skin and kind of view it as well, you did your job.
So we have two hands, I think Alexander Dodge and then Marianne Righaug.
Hi, thanks for the interesting discussion. I'm Alexander, I'm from the Department of Geography here at NTNU. And one of the things I wanted to add to the discussion was there seems to be a tendency when discussing these, natural science, social science sort of collaborations, that it's the technology, the natural scientist jobs to develop, good technological solutions, and then the social scientist jobs to figure out how they can be implemented. And but a lot of what social scientists do is understanding how society works and understanding how society can work better. I mean, that tends to be our main sort of objective in the way. And there's a question on how do we kind of take that in the opposite direction, where we look at how can society be organized in a fairer, more just, more equitable way, And to what extent can technological solutions help us reach those goals? So I mean, and for Norway, for example, I mean, the big, elephant in the room is of course that we're extremely dependent on oil in terms of our economy, and there's a need, of course, to imagine what a post-extractive Norwegian society would look like in terms of welfare, for example. And so to what extent can we as social scientists start to try to create these imaginaries around what a post-extractive society could look at, and have natural scientists sort of supporting our aims instead of being the opposite way around in that sense? So it'd be interesting to hear your ideas on that.
Yeah, what a question, Alexander. It's like a Nobel Prize winning question. I don't think we can solve the roots of injustice and capitalism necessarily even through energy and climate change. But I do have a few reactions. The first is, this is where I think the arts and humanities play a really good role. Yes, we can do really good research on imaginaries, right, and post-petroscape landscapes and what Norway may look like without meat, or may look like without oil. Probably a lot of tourism, from what I've been reading about Norwegian futures. That's just one way, though. Another way would be to make a movie. Another way would be to make a poem, make a song, make an image, make a comic book. So this is also other ways of capturing the imagination of the public in very compelling ways. So it's not just here's a report or here's this thing called an imaginary, which, by the way, most non-social scientists just think it's a typo, right? Imaginary, you mean imagination, right? So I think think through other ways of communicating beyond just standard research. But another answer connects a little bit with what Tomas was saying, and my colleague, they're still my colleagues, Tomas. Johan Schott and Laura Kanger have been working on deep transitions. How do we scale large-scale shifts in sociotechnical systems to align towards common directionality? And more importantly, they have other work on transforming innovation. And this work is actually very relevant for you, because I think most of us, especially physical scientists, are still captured in like this 1970s thinking about, it's called the linear model of technology and innovation. The natural scientists design the technology, the business people help market it, and then the social scientists help communicate it and look at diffusion, right? So it's nice and linear, it's sequential, and of course, social scientists are going last after the economists and the business scholars and the natural scientists. And I think that thinking is very flawed, because it's not always linear, and also not all technologies should be marketed, right? And not all technologies will have positive impacts on diffusion. Look at nuclear weapons or pesticides. And what Johan and Laura have done is they've problematized that entire approach and said that the second approach has been innovation ecosystems, right? Or technological innovation systems. And then the third approach, which is the approach we need right now, is to harness innovation to solve social problems like inequality, species loss, the SDGs. And they call this transforming innovation. And this views the innovation process no longer as sequential, no longer as deterministic. It talks a lot more about co-design, responsible innovation dynamics, and basically not treating technology as a black box, so that users themselves and the public or publics are involved at the start of the process to even debate whether the technology should go forward. So it's a much more constructive way of dealing with technology assessment. And you can read their paper on transforming innovation systems. But I like it because it implies it's our job now to harness innovation, not for itself, but to solve our most pressing problems. Otherwise, what's good? If it's not part of the solution, it's part of the problem.
So I want to thank everyone for coming in, and especially Benjamin for being with us. And if you thought this was interesting, there is a new webinar on the 13th of October. There will be information on that soon. So thanks to everyone and for asking questions and engaging. And yeah, that's it, I guess. Thanks a lot.